welcome and introduction. And then I wanted to share some of the emerging public health framework that we at the Thrivance Group have been developing to think about how we want to approach the work of reparations and public health problems. So, all right. So I'm getting a message that says that I'm having low system resources. So if we begin to have audio issues or other challenges, I may need to just turn off my camera, but we're just going to do our best to keep it going this way. So I'm going to share that, and then I'm going to go in presentation mode. So just give me one more second. And you all let me know. Maybe, I think I gotta turn off my camera. Oh wait, maybe it'll work. Okay. It's coming, y'all. Maybe. It really doesn't want to do it. All right, I'm going to try turning off my camera, which I really did not want to do, to see if I can share the screen in this way. Can you all see that now?
Yes, we can.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Looks
all
good.
Right. So good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
And welcome to this breakout session on public health and spatial reparations. My name is Kelly McIntyre. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a planner at the Thrivance Group. Right now, I'm streaming to you from Atlanta, but typically I lay my head in the stolen land of the Lenape people, better known as Philadelphia. I was also born on the stolen land of the Lenape people, known as New Jersey. And for those that might benefit from a visual description, I am a chocolate brown Black woman with long locks that are pulled up into a high bun. I'm wearing a Black t-shirt with red, black, and green American flag on it. I am a descendant of enslaved Africans who settled in Georgia and North Carolina and later migrated to New Jersey. I'm a mom, I'm a community organizer, block captain, I'm a basketball coach, I'm a lot of things. And I came to public health by way of physical activity promotion, health and wellness promotion. And I, before coming to the Thrivance Group, spent 7 years in Philadelphia working in the public sector in the interest of racialized communities. And my interest is really in addressing the root causes of all health disparities, which I think are structural racism, white supremacy, patriarchy, capitalism, and colonialism. So we're here today to talk about public health and spatial reparations And I'm really excited about that topic and hope that you all will engage in the conversation as well. So actually, before we get started with our some of our Thrivance Group emerging public health interests, I wonder if other folks are willing to turn on your microphone and introduce yourself, your name, your preferred pronouns, your affiliations if you choose, so that we can get to know one another before the conversation begins. And okay, I see you've turned your microphone on. Thank you, Naomi. You can start.
All right, yeah, I'll start. And then should I popcorn it to someone?
That would be great. Thank
Okay.
you.
My name is Naomi. My preferred pronouns are she, her. And I'm sorry, what was your last question?
Your affiliation, teammate.
Oh, my affiliation to the Thrivance Group is that I'm a part of the Thrivance Group team. And yeah, that's my affiliation. I will popcorn it to Pia.
Good morning. I am Pia, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. My affiliations, I'm from Brooklyn, New York. I have a nonprofit organization called Creating Legacies, building community through inspiring families to grow together and collectively. I also have an LLC, sorry, that was my alarm to make sure that I was here, called Wise Hearted Hands, where I do both political consulting and mentoring around different structures and deconstructing structures in community. And I'm a professor at New York University Graduate School of Social Work and a mom.
Thank you.
I will pass it to Laura.
Good morning, everyone. I'm in Chapel Hill, Carborough to be specific, North Carolina. And I've just really enjoyed this conversation today. I am a researcher at UNC's Highway Safety Research Center. I come by way of studying at UNC in the Department of Planning and then in the Department of Public Health and Epidemiology. A lot of my research is around injury prevention practices and looking at how they're adopted by agencies and communities and how there's gaps between the community need and the agency practice. And so this is just such a rich conversation and support group, I think, to talk about the innovations that are happening and the challenges ahead.
Thank you, Laura. I see Aaliyah next on my screen. Aaliyah, are you able to turn on your microphone and introduce yourself?
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Aaliyah. I go by she, her, hers pronouns. I am proud to say this is my third Unurbanist Assembly. Very proud to say that, and still very much benefiting and learning from all the contributors. I am a master's student studying urban and regional planning. I also work within public health. I'm a mum and I have a work background in community and economic regeneration. And I don't think there's anybody else to popcorn to right now, but thank you so much. You're welcome.
Thank you so much. I see Simi on the screen. Simi, would you like to introduce yourself? Or maybe not. We'll come back to Simi. Feel free to turn on your microphone at any point to introduce yourself. We'll go ahead and get started. Thank you all for introducing yourself. I just want to shout out Laura.
Hi. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
My name is Simi. Uh-huh. I'm on.
Simi,
Simi, we hear you.
we hear you, Simi.
Sorry, I'm on a delay. I don't know what's going on with my computer.
It is okay. Simi is also a member of the Thrivent team here at Thrivent's Group, and I think our computers, our bodies, everything is telling us that we are nearing the end of the third annual Unurbanist Assembly. So thank you all for introducing yourself. Shout out to Laura, because I am also a fellow Tar Heel. But back then I was studying exercise and sports science at University of North Carolina. So
Always a small world.
it is a small world. Had I known, I'd have studied public health back then. you know, so thank you all for introducing yourself. I hope that you will continue to feel comfortable turning on your microphone and joining in the conversation. I wanted to start. By sharing some of our emerging public health framework, just a glimpse of some of it, not all of it, that I think will help to shape our conversation. Let's see if my computer will cooperate. There we go. Oh, I'm sorry, my computer has a little bit of a delay and it is challenging. There we go. Okay, so our team has spent significant time over the past several months working together to establish a shared understanding of what we believe public health is. And one of the things that we've said is that our approach to public health works to provide redress for the concentrated harm of poverty, disenfranchisement, and intentional community disinvestment inflicted on oppressed communities by local, state, and federal officials, businesses, and an inadequate healthcare response. So I just wanted to lift up for a second that as we talk about providing redress, we'll reflect back on some of the comments from this, from the keynote that we just left, right? That talked about being clear about what the harm is that we are attempting to address. And in general, we recognize the harms of poverty and the disenfranchisement and how cities and municipalities and our federal government, in addition to corporate interests, have continued to actively disinvest, actively disenfranchise, actively exclude us, our communities, from their plans, and that there are health consequences to that. We've also decided that our framework includes that our approach to public health will rely on the reallocation and the responsible use of collective resources and not capital interests to properly resource solutions. So as we continue to talk about the ways that reparations can be funded, we need to remember our collective resources and who's making decisions about those, and also being sure not to rely on resources that one could be taken away at any moment, and also not rely on the resources that continue to perpetuate harm in our communities. Our approach to public health also values and fully realizes the decision-making power that's held by oppressed communities. So as we talk about a reparative approach to public health issues, we should remember that the communities that have been most impacted by health disparities have decision-making power and it needs to be realized, and we need to make sure that we're centering the people that have been most harmed, and moving from their voices in how we address health disparities. We also recognize that the built environment is one of the most appropriate venues for public health interventions. And oftentimes in public health, we talk about systems, policies, and environments, recognizing that the context that we live in shapes our health outcomes. So when we think about reparations, it's not just cut the check, but yes, cut the check, but also how can we address the intentional disinvestment that we've talked about so much over the last 23 hours. And finally, a Thriving's approach to public health works to build life-affirming institutions and systems and environments that racialized people deserve and have been systematically denied since the founding of this nation. So as we talk about a reparative approach to public health problems, we need to be imaginative about what life-affirming institutions and systems and environments could look like. So now, I wanted to move us into some conversation about which built environment harms in our local communities require a public health redress. And I'll offer an example, and then I will come out of sharing my screen so that we can engage in dialogue and hear about what built environment harms in your local communities might require a public health redress. So let me share an example from my community. As I said, I live in Philadelphia. Our local transportation agency in Philadelphia is called SEPTA, Southeastern Pennsylvania Transit Authority, I think. And this is the 75 bus. It's in my neighborhood. This is my neighborhood. This picture from Hidden City, Philadelphia is taken from the regional rail train station that I would take to work every day. It's about just 8 blocks from my house. And in 2017, SEPTA made a plan to build a new natural, and I'm putting that in quotes, a natural gas plant facility that's located at 4301 Wissahickon Avenue in what's called the Nicetown neighborhood of Philadelphia. And just a little background, Nicetown is home to about 25,000 Philadelphians, mostly Black. And it's classified as, or zoned as industrial 2. And we understand that in addition to a thriving Black community that has just many community organizations that are actively fighting, and religious organizations. I think about one of the most impactful ministries or outreach that I see happening in the community, coming from a very small church in the neighborhood, but also some pocket parks that are like community hubs that are always programmed with wonderful things. In addition, though, Nicetown community residents suffer from some of the most challenging health outcomes in the city. From the Philadelphia Department of Public Health, we understand that Nicetown in Philadelphia has the second highest childhood asthma hospitalization rate in the city, and also is in terms of neighborhood communities, has the second highest rates of cancer mortality. Probably not a surprise given that it's zoned industrial too. It's third in the city for mental health challenges and cardiovascular disease, preventable cardiovascular disease. And so there are some real health challenges that are really connected to the use of the land in Nicetown. You can see on the right side of this picture, that is a huge storage facility. So there's this residential block a tiny residential block that this bus comes down across the street from the regional rail station, a storage facility right there. Let me orient you a little bit more. This image is from WHYY. It's a sort of a snapshot of the neighborhood. One of the challenges with this natural gas plant is that it is situated in between the rail yard and the largest diesel bus depot in the city. So the Midvale Bus Depot, which has 300 buses leaving from it each day, in the regional rail yard, right north of that. They've decided to situate this natural gas plant. It's actually a combined power and heating plant. Is situated right in between that. And I don't know if you can see, but just to the upper left corner of the screen is Route 1. We call the Roosevelt Boulevard, or in that segment is called the Roosevelt Expressway. It's one of those highways that was built in not only divided community, but it's also classified as one of the most dangerous strips of highway in the country. And the exhaust from the traffic, the risk of traffic fatalities and injuries from traffic crashes, the really high number of buses and other truck traffic and things that are coming from the site. There's actually on this Midvale property, there's also a metal recycling plant. So there's just so much harmful land use concentrated into about a 2-mile area. And the surrounding community is predominantly Black, and these children our children in this community, in our community, are really suffering from high rates of asthma. So in 2017, with that information, SEPTA decided to place this natural gas plant. The community, of course, organized to fight this plant. So as you can see, this photo comes from the Philadelphia Tribune. There's all types of folks that were really, really up in arms and fought a really long, hard battle, legal battle, which unfortunately our community eventually lost. So now we have this gas plant in our community. And so, some of the challenges of this gas plant is that it's inefficiently used gas. So not only are you making natural gas that is supposed to both generate electricity for the regional rail trains that I mentioned earlier, but it's also supposed to heat the bus depot building. Up to 90% of the heating energy could be reused, but I understand that gas plant is being used very inefficiently, that the Air Management Services Division of the Philadelphia Department of Public Health also approved this permit with the presumption that air quality would not be worsened by the placement of this plant, but You can imagine the challenges of that based on the existing air quality that they were comparing it to. There's also the Environmental Protection Agency. There's nothing in their permit process that maximizes greenhouse gases or that requires them to monitor the efficiency of this facility. So it gets placed here, it's already outdated technology, it's in our community, and it's just piled on top of the toxic land use that has existed in this community since the mid 1800s. So as we think about the harms of our community, I think about this specific harm of this gas plant, which is a new harm that now the community will deal with moving forward. It runs 365 days a year. And even though clearly the buildings don't need to be heated 365 days a year, and the impacts of that, the health impacts of that, are on the shoulders of Black and Brown children, elders, and a community that is already fighting for its life. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen because I'd really like to engage in conversation, to just talk about when we think about public health and spatial reparations, we need to think about who's being harmed first, right? And be very specific about who the individuals or communities are that we're talking about. So clearly, I keep mentioning the Black children in Nicetown, the community in Nicetown. And I've mentioned who some of the perpetrators of harm are. I wonder if there are examples from your own communities that you would like to share or discuss, examples of land use decisions that have public health implications that might benefit from a reparative approach. Are there any thoughts there?
Kelly, your example definitely resonated with me. And in North Carolina, we're going through a statewide multimodal freight strategic planning process. And it's fascinating to see the process that's been laid out by the agency and the consulting firm that they've hired. And like you said, the root causes are patriarchy and racism and capitalism. And basically, those are the three entities kind of driving the process for the strategic freight plan. And they're not engaging public health. They're not identifying harms. They're really engaging the owners of the freight companies to identify where roadways need to be expanded to increase the capacity and decrease the delay of the freight. And what we see is just the engagement plan has nothing to do with the communities that are impacted by high volume freight corridors and the air quality concerns that come with that, and the noise and the lack of access to physical opportunities and greenways and space when they expand the highways across the state to make room for more truck capacity. And it feels like there's no public health considerations being integrated into the process in any meaningful way. All the data and the performance metrics are aligned with measuring capacity, and truck speed, and so it feels like there's just a deep disconnect with the strategic plans and the process, and what the public health and identified needs of the communities are. And it's across the state. And so I think at the state level, it's even harder to get into the specifics of the individuals and the communities that are harmed, because it's at such a high level that they're just, it's just steamrolled over those issues.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, Laura. I'm also reminded that in the case that I just shared, and I think in many cases, even when there is meaningful public health involvement in the process, the tools of public health that we're using lack the sensitivity to protect our health, specifically of Black communities, right? And allows us to prioritize capitalist interests, moving of freight, or in the case of SEPTA's gas plant, they were moving from oil to now this natural gas facility, which I can hear Dr. Thomas in my head talking about the green burden that Black communities often have to carry. Oh, we're going to move to this more efficient way, type of energy. Although I would argue that this is also not green, but that I think that's one of our interests at Thrivance Group as we develop our public health focus for this next chapter of our work. Really thinking about how can our processes and the tools that we use in planning for land use really be sensitive to the needs of Black, Brown, oppressed, excluded, disinvested communities moving forward, and how can we create tools that actually help us to identify when a project is going to perpetuate harm, or oh no, when a decision is going to perpetuate harm. Let me just end that thought there. And I'm really sorry to hear that there isn't even a process in place in the state of North Carolina where I told you my family migrated from, does not have that in place.
There's a process, but it's not a good one.
It's not a good one, yeah.
No. But I love the definitions that you shared, and I'm wondering if you have those somewhere that can be cited and shared with public officials as well.
It's forthcoming. Stay tuned.
Okay.
We will be updating our website to share our public health framework as we continue to as our plans and continue to emerge. So stay tuned. It's coming soon.
That's amazing. Thank you.
Yeah. Anyone else have an example of land use, toxic land use in your community that you think has public health implications and might benefit from a reparative approach?
This is definitely not land use, but I think it gives light to, I'm sure, a lot of our cities and what we see around sanitation. So I'm in Brooklyn, New York, specifically in the Flatbush community, which is literally like 100% recent Black immigrant community. And the tension that I always see around sanitation is that our New York City sanitation department indeed hires majority Black people, or if it's white people, it's definitely those who maybe have not had higher education, meaning college or graduate school. So it does position people in a whole different way economically by working for the Department of Sanitation. So there's that piece. But then within the community, because of the gentrification that is ongoing, as I'm sure in many cities, we have, looking at the picture that you showed, homeowners who are Black, either African American or of Caribbean descent, or recent Caribbean immigrants who have and continue to own homes, some multi-generationally. So that is amazing to see, differently than lots of parts of our city in this community. So what I saw by that plant being put up, meaning there, I don't know if houses were torn down or what, but I do see that in New York, where we have, it could be one sliver of a vacant lot or a larger lot, and developers are purchasing the property, which, as I understand it, they're able to do, because if they can afford the property, they can legally purchase it. And they also have a right to build as far as the air rights will allow on that property. And either, if they're building apartments, which is what's common right now, charge market rate for those apartments, which of course do not match the property or the price that many of the existing Black people paid for their homes at the time in which they bought it, which is mostly pre-gentrification time, which I don't know what's on record, but just from living there and understanding the dynamics of community, I see 9/11, which was 2001, as a pivotal point for New York City in particular, of the drive of people who had monetary wealth moving into specifically the borough of Brooklyn first, I believe, and then spreading out into the other boroughs. So you had a community that in some ways had a lot of self-sustenance, but then because of the tragedy of 9/11, people pushed in to Brooklyn. And then when they realized the glory and beauty of our architecture, of our cultural attractions, were willing and able to pay absolute top dollar and beyond for the same properties that Black people have lived collectively in, with aunties, uncles, grandpas, paying for that mortgage and raising families. So sorry, I wanted to give that context. So what I see around sanitation is that these new developments come. So you have a block, like you showed, of smaller residential homes that have had the same population for decades. And then you put up one building, not even as big as that plant, but it might be, even if it's a 6-story building, which in theory, what's described when we go to our land use meetings is in contextual zoning to the existing 6-story buildings that are here. But those buildings had an apartment with, maybe 5 family members in one apartment at a certain price. And now we're putting up these luxury buildings that, either have one person per apartment, or in some cases have roommates, so they're splitting the rent. And now you have a whole building full of people that's generating more garbage. It's a culture of people who are accustomed to shopping online, where I would dare say, even though we're, in this pandemic phase, many of our African-American and Caribbean families do not shop online. You will still see our supermarkets, with lines, which also creates a social environment for people. Yeah. So the Amazon shopping and the food shopping delivery does not necessarily happen the same way, but it does in these new developments. So the generation of garbage and also recycling is tremendous. And then what happens is the same sanitation workers are expected to pick up the garbage of those luxury buildings. But you go from having, like in the picture you showed, a family with one recycling can and one garbage can that might not even be full on pickup day, to having garbage piled up, literally 7-8 feet in the air outside of a building. The discrepancy I see with that is the health concern that presents by having stinking garbage that now generates rats and roaches in a city that's already densely populated, where even though the sanitation is diligent about picking up that garbage, the volume is insane. So now it takes them longer to pick up the garbage. The street is blocked off for a longer period of time. That does not diminish the issue around vermin, which is in the community. And because the nuances, the sanitation workers are mostly African-American, I would say, and white American, sort of Italian heritage, which has context in New York City for who also is marginalized. they don't hire more sanitation workers. It's the same workers now that we've said, hey, Johnny, what's up? Over the years, picking up this volume of garbage. And while the business establishments are required to get private sanitation and pay into private sanitation, which is its own animal of a sort, these luxury developers who really are spending way more money, millions of dollars in a community versus a traditional retail or restaurant, often Black-owned business who's required to pay separately for private sanitation, they have the access to the city sanitation. So it's either, I feel they should have to pay into private sanitation and also properly sort of masking that garbage, maybe in an area in the building that upon building the building is created, so that it's not on the street side where children cannot now jump double dutch on that sidewalk or play or walk through with their strollers. Or absolutely, when that building comes, it's a simultaneous effort and diligent effort to hire more sanitation who still reflect the ethnicities of the people in community at that same or even greater wage, because the sanitation workers are paid very well in comparison to many of the jobs throughout the city. So it does provide absolute growth and home ownership. Many of the homeowners in the community have worked for city agencies over the years, and that's how they've been able to purchase. So that's a system that we see works. But then when it actually is a system that has worked, we see how this recent gentrification seeks to disrupt that.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
No, I love how you, first of all, thank you for sharing. Thank you for the framing and the context, the cultural context of the community, and also helping us to think about how land use, thinking about who's impacted by land use decisions. I don't know that people that I would have drawn that line to think about the impact, the health impacts on sanitation workers of those types of developments. And hello, Pilar, welcome to the space. So thank you for sharing that. That also reminds me of another teaching that I've gotten from the Thrivance Group before I was even a staff member here. Dr. Thomas often shared how it's hard to frame what reparations could look like when the harm is ongoing, right? So in all of these cases, both what I shared, what Laura shared, and what you shared, Pia, are examples of ongoing harm, not just something that happened and now we can look back at how we might be able to identify who was harmed, who perpetrated the harm, and what's needed to make people whole again, right? But if we're continuing to make those kinds of decisions, if we're continuing to ignore some of these issues that you're talking about, or maybe it's not ignoring, maybe, I don't know if it's a part of the conversation in New York, the need to increase the capacity of the sanitation staff to meet the needs of the changing neighborhoods, right? But thank you for raising that. Go ahead, Pia.
Still reflect the communities that they're serving, because I feel like city jobs are the best kept secret that specifically African-American and marginalized white groups in New York City have been able to get city worker jobs over the decades because other people did not want them, or others had higher education that allowed them to go for different positions. But now that the word is getting out a little bit more of the types of salaries that one can have in the city jobs and the mobility it gives in home and land ownership and owning businesses, now you're starting to have people apply for those jobs who have master's degrees that don't, I know a lot of us here do, but we recognize and acknowledge that is not necessarily common in our communities. And so now it's this positioning where the jobs that were available to people, now they're not able to get them anymore. So it's increasing the sanitation, but also making sure that in that increase of recruiting and hiring, that we're still making sure to hire those who reflect us as African Americans, Caribbean Americans, and marginalized groups.
Right. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. I wonder, does anyone else have an example in your own community of harmful land use that has public health implications that we could be thinking about, and thinking about who is being harmed by that, or who was harmed by that decision, who is responsible for that decision, and how people might be made whole again?
Something that I'm thinking of, Kelly, this is Dr. Thomas.
Hi, DT.
Something that I'm thinking of is, I could name a lot of harmful land use practices in every city that I've lived in, but I'm also thinking about how that harm is exacerbated when you as a resident can't name who is accountable for the harm, right? So like a lot of times these agencies co-conspire, work in partnership, or have joint projects, joint initiatives to implement these projects, or to locate their depots and manufacturing plants and charging stations in our communities, and it's impossible for the residents in the neighborhoods to resist, push back, question, challenge, or even in some cases agree with what's happening, because they have intentionally built these projects under the guise of some new partnership that is not an agency that you can hold accountable. So you can't trace the dollars, you can't find the purse strings, you can't make a voting decision, because they kind of just mysteriously show up in our communities. And I'm thinking about even the well-meaning projects, like the ones that we see through these opportunity zones, which we have found not to be very helpful. Or in California, there's transformative climate communities projects where we're seeing an influx of $35 million plus in a small neighborhood that's been marked as, being sensitive or vulnerable to climate change. And because the partnership is, 30 entities deep, residents don't really know how to engage in that work, and who to leverage their grievances with. So I think the harm is compounded by just the ambiguity of the whole thing.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, Dr. Thomas.
Yeah, I could share, but I also want to be mindful of time.
We started a few minutes late, so we'll wrap up in just a few minutes. So go ahead and we'll hear from you, Pilar.
Yeah, so in my family's community in South Carolina, Beaufort County, South Carolina, it's a type of gentrification that I see happening that I don't feel like is represented in the conversations of gentrification. So my father's family were descendants of slaves, and they bought their land on the coast of South Carolina, where it's like very swampy, and people really didn't want to live there. So they were able to acquire this land. So this land has been in families for a long time. Some of the land is tied up in trusts, others are owned by people, but property values have consistently decreased, even though we're very close to Hilton Head, Fripp Island, these places where they've created these communities and built out luxury places, private beaches, things like this that my family doesn't have access to. And what I've noticed is, as people pass away and land becomes available, now developers can buy that land for very, very low cost, flip it, make a profit, and there's more. It's a very segregated area, and I've never seen so many white people who live on my father's island. And yeah, so I think about what does reparations look like for people who may have had land, but their land is really undervalued and also at risk because of climate change. And yeah, that's just another piece of the conversation that I don't have a solution to just yet. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing, Pilar. And I think in this conversations about public health and spatial reparations, I don't expect us to leave this space today with solutions, right? Because those solutions really should be arrived at with a full understanding of who's impacted and through their voices, right? So, but thank you for raising that issue. I don't know that I knew about that or had thought about what gentrification and displacement looks like in that context. So thank you for sharing that. And I understand, just so you all know, we can continue this conversation for a bit longer, actually. We can continue for up till 9 o'clock. So I think it's important for us to think about what's happening in our communities and be able to at least identify the harms and then think about, can we also, if you can, think about what are the potential health impacts or what are the known health impacts of the decisions that we're talking about. I see in the chat that Pia has been following some of those issues in South Carolina as well. So are there other folks that have examples of harmful land use that has public health implications in your own community that you'd like to put on the table for discussion and think through collectively?
I think another thing that we could name here is the where they locate certain institutions geographically. And so, like, I talk about this a lot, but like prisons are very toxic form of land use. A lot of manufacturing happens in prisons, but also there's the types of things that we would do to prevent widespread illness don't happen in or around prisons, and also the way waste is managed in and around prisons is very toxic. And they're often located, well, at least in California, which houses, I think I saw a statistic that said California, the state, houses 40% of all incarcerated people in the world. I hope that's not accurate, but those prisons are often located in either rural communities or the suburbs, the outskirts of urban cores where mostly Black and brown people migrate to. And then the workforce in those communities, all of the available jobs tend to be somehow associated with those prisons. And then the employees, the staff of those prisons get exposed to those toxins, and it disseminates around to the surrounding community. So prisons themselves are very toxic, but other institutions too. I'm thinking about where we locate hospitals, and how not that the hospitals themselves are toxic, but the distances that we ask people to travel for care in many cases, it is in and of itself a public health issue. When I was working squarely in the realm of Vision Zero, which is the transportation initiative to eradicate fatal and severe car-related crashes, what I found was that we were, creating these hotspot maps, these high injury networks where we were saying people were most likely to die or be injured. But what we didn't include in that analysis was perhaps if there were a trauma center located near the incident, this person wouldn't have experienced long-term illness or death, right? So I think that's an issue. And then also something that I encountered a lot while living in both Los Angeles and Oakland is where we locate mental institutions and behavioral health facilities that often serve as a form of incarceration as well. But what would happen is I used to work that early morning shift, so I would have to be on the bus around 3, 4, 5 a.m. And these hospitals, these mental institutions, they literally kick everyone out. They dump, we call it hospital dumping, everyone who doesn't have insurance or everyone who they suspect is homeless and seeking care at that same hour. So the buses would be crammed full of people who were just displaced from these institutions with nowhere to go. And you just would be trying to get to work while they're trying to navigate where their next stop is. And thinking about the world of the pandemic, I don't know that this practice is still happening. I hear that it is, but I'm also thinking about how even in a pandemic, the way we are treating unhoused people and people with cognitive differences, and how that is related to the land use decisions in terms of how we locate or don't locate places where we need to seek care near where we live, near where the people who are seeking care live. So those are a couple of things that come to mind for me.
All excellent examples. I'm thinking about specifically the healthcare facilities and hospitals and the distance people have to travel for care. In the Philadelphia context, we had a large hospital system that over the past 10 or 15 years had several facilities in the city that have closed, 2 of which were trauma centers, one of which was very close to the Roosevelt Boulevard that I talked about earlier, one of the most dangerous strips of roadway in the country. They closed this trauma center. That was the closest trauma center to the most dangerous street, dangerous roadway in Philadelphia. And I don't know that's been a part of the conversation as we talk in the Vision Zero conversation, Vision Zero space in Philadelphia. So thank you for raising that. And also what you just shared, Dr. Thomas, also reminds me of last night's conversation with the folks from Close the Jail ATL, who were sharing about the jail that was built in response to the planning for the 1996 Olympics to sort of clean up downtown Atlanta and move houseless and other people that we've criminalized, survivors, people living in poverty. And the vision for that jail that I understand literally was supposed to be closed. Former Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms made a commitment to that closure, but that has not quite happened yet. But now the people that have been advocating for the closure have successfully fought to decriminalize 41 of the 81 minor offenses that were landing people in that jail space, including things like pedestrian in the roadway, AKA jaywalking, or public loudness, being Black in public. But that I understand that the city has fewer people incarcerated there, that there are maybe as few as 20 people incarcerated in an entire building, that hopefully will be closed soon. But what I also heard in that session last night was the community's vision for how to reutilize that space as a place of health and wellness to provide supports for the very people that were criminalized and incarcerated in that space. And I think as I was listening to that conversation, I just thought this is a wonderful example of an opportunity for reparations in public health, where we are not only decriminalizing poverty and survivorship and all of the challenges that people face that our society has not wanted to address as a whole, but that we are reimagining collectively how we can take that land and that space and utilize it to meet the needs of the very people that were harmed by it, and centering their voices in those decisions. So that was a wonderful session last night. What you just shared about prisons, Dr. Thomas, reminded me of that. And I just wanted to offer it into this space as well.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas. I love everything that you spoke to. Resonates so much with so much that's going on in all of our cities. In particular, I have tension, as does the community, with what we call in New York, I don't know if that's a general term, social service dumping, which you touched on with the mental health institutions. So in our community, we have temporary housing units that, for example, one of the Catholic churches that had this grassy campus when I was growing up, as a college student, I was able to teach enrichment, English enrichment and religious enrichment to students there who were Black students. So it was a place where people were able to grow and build community. That was torn down, and it was bought by developers that specifically do temporary housing. So they did build a beautiful temporary housing location that also has campus and has a garden space for the people who are temporarily housed. But the issues where I touched on the internalized racism in my talk yesterday very lightly, but I see how these things really continue to allow people to seethe in the internalized racism, because now you have, in this example, I mentioned the cultures because it is very significant in Brooklyn. African-American people who for the most part were in the early waves of gentrification in Bedford-Stuyvesant, which is historically African-American. When people were migrating from the South to Brooklyn, that is where they went and owned beautiful brownstones that over the years, through land use manipulation, those houses were pretty much stolen and duped out of people's hands. So now you have this huge population of specifically African-American people from Bedford-Stuyvesant and Crown Heights who have been displaced and homeless. So the temporary housing has been offered to them, now pushed back a little bit toward the Flatbush community, which is Caribbean, specifically Caribbean, recent immigrants, or maybe even second, third generation immigrants. But there is a cultural dynamic that happens because of this structural ways in which we are pitted against each other. And this is over the centuries. And so we find in these temporary housing units, it's African-American people who are not housed in a predominantly Caribbean or Caribbean-American section of Brooklyn, where people are homeowners or have lived in apartments perhaps for decades. And so there's this feeling of, why are you dumping them here? But we're all Black, and the developers and the city doesn't understand or care about these cultural nuances. But I see how it contributes to the hate that's building within our own community against our own identities. And then the systemic issue of, so the temporary housing is beautiful and campus and garden, but this is for maybe a month. And then allegedly you're going to place people in permanent housing. But we know our New York City public housing, which would be the places in theory that people might go, formerly known as the projects, have also, many of them have closed and become private developments, or they are not sending people there anymore. So there, again, is no structural change around providing opportunities education that really speaks to people's gifts and talents, providing career options, not just jobs in the big retail businesses that are also displacing small retail, because we see that given the retail jobs at the hourly wage that's not reliable. But there's no structure in place to now really build people who are coming from amazing greatness, as we all are. And so when we talk about land use in our community, we have quite a few of those. And then visually, while I'm honest, it is a nice space for that very temporary time for people and their families. But visually, it's like a middle finger to people who have owned their homes for decades, and like many, I think, on this call even, struggling to just do basic repairs, much less a gut restoration of your home. And then right across the street, you have a beautiful temporary housing with campus, but people who are looking for an apartment building that's similar would never be able to afford something that actually looks like that. So no matter what career and education in Brooklyn people might have, they still might find themselves in an apartment that's overpriced, that's small, that has roaches, that has mice, that has rats, all of that, despite what their resume might say, or even their bank account. So all of this I see as dynamics that are continuously pitting Black people, though, against each other. And we as this movement, I'm grateful we're doing this because we have the eye to understand also how that really hurts the very soul of the collective of our community. So as we advocate on the policy level, that's like one piece of it. I want us to all be mindful of, in our community organizing, how we're also bringing awareness to the hood really of what's really going down, so that we don't continue to breed these negative feelings against our own people.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for sharing that, Pia. Thank you for sharing that. So we've got about, I see some folks just giving you some affirmation on that comment, Pia. We've got about 9 minutes before we need to wrap up. And we've talked about several examples in communities in different geographic locations, the different geographic typologies, and some of the challenges with land use that we think may have public health impact. That's just the beginning, right, of this conversation, right? Because I think there's still, and P is getting into it a little bit, thinking about who's impacted directly by these decisions. And I'm thinking about something else I learned from you, Dr. Thomas, about making sure that as we think about a reparative approach to the challenges of our site, or a reparative approach to specific harms perpetrated, that we need to make sure that it's not a slap in the face, or, as Pia just said, a middle finger to the people that are impacted, right? So thank you for sharing that. I wonder if other folks have anything they wanted to discuss. Specifically, I'd love to think about who's impacted and what are the health challenges, what are the potential health consequences of some of these issues that we're talking about. And I'm still thinking about last night's session on close the jail ATL and the implications of that Olympic complex. And I'm thinking about how that is repeated all around the globe, right? How when the Olympic Games are coming, we're gonna build a whole little city for a small group of people that are gonna live here for 4 to 6 weeks, people that we think are really important and special that need to be protected, right? And the harms of that land use for the people that live in those spaces historically, are displaced from those spaces for that purpose, and or in the case of close the jail ATL, this ongoing harm of this. Now it's a jail that we put here. That's a remnant of the Olympic Village, if you would. And how is the Olympic Committee being held responsible for the harms, the ongoing harms that they've left in communities around the world? I think about Rio. Think about, well, I don't know much about what happened in Sydney, but I'm imagining that this is an issue in every city where we've decided to build an Olympic village. So let me give the space back to you all to share about your local context, what's on your mind, who are the people you're thinking about. Oh, Naomi said this also happened in Cape Town for the Olympics in particular.
Yeah, I believe it was the Olympics or the World Cup, one or the other.
Mm.
Yeah, where they built a highway and also like, you know, kind of just tunnels to connect the city to the stadium. So yeah.
Yeah. I just realized also that Philadelphia was just celebrating this week being selected as a World Cup city. And I am wondering, in our city that is challenged with gun violence, sanitation challenges, and air quality issues, high rates of chronic disease, what the World Cup really means for us. I think we also always talk about the economic impact of those types of things. But again, I wonder if we can develop some tools and begin to think together about really understanding the health impacts, specifically on oppressed and excluded communities of these types of decisions. Well, if no one else has anything that you want to offer into the space, I'll begin to close us out. I see there's something in the chat. Let me read it. Often when these committees are formed, the original groups of people, Pia shares, often when these committees are formed, the original groups of people don't see the projects to fruition. It's intentional that no one involved truly understands all of the dynamics at play for these events and developments. That's what Dr. T was referring to as not being able to see the face of the dollars. All of this is intentional by the billionaires that are behind all of this. Hence, community members are exploited to encourage people to support projects. Ooh, and actually, I'm so glad that thank you for connecting those dots. This actually brings us full circle. Hold on, let me read one more comment before I close this out. Pilar is just holding up the, Villa Autodromo. Autodromo, one of the neighborhoods in Rio that the state demolished to make way for the Olympic Village and moved residents 2.5 hours by public transport outside of the city. And then Pia shared that they really don't realize that they're hurting their own community. So I think this brings us full circle as to where this conversation started, and recognizing the harms of how capitalism or capitalist interests, structural racism, disenfranchisement, disinvestment, and exclusion really does have health impacts. And as we, as public health professionals, seek to eliminate health disparities, we need to be considering what are our options for redress and repair. We also, though, before we can do that, need to be able to, we need to stop the harmful practices, right? We need to be able to name the harmful practices. We need to be able to understand them. So I challenge us, and I believe planners are public health professionals, to really think critically about how can we develop tools that help us to understand the true impact of our planning decisions. So I thank you all for coming into the space this morning, for being a part of Unurbanist Assembly 2022. And with that, I will close us out. We do have one more comment in the chat from Ahmad.
I was just responding to the comment about maybe they don't realize that they're hurting our community. And I feel like to some degree on those bodies, those boards, I just don't think they care. I think it's profit over people when these projects are coming in, and they use it as like an economic investment, as I think a form of public health, right? That they're making it brand spanking new. Not for you, maybe for somebody else.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I'll just put that out there, that with the example that I shared in Philadelphia with the placement of that natural gas plant, everyone knew the harm. And the people that were charged with protecting community health, abdicated that responsibility, right? So how can we make sure we hold ourselves responsible to making sure that we are not doing harm? How can our health impact assessments, our environmental impact assessments actually be utilized and refined to make sure that they're sensitive to the actual needs of Black, Brown, oppressed, excluded, and other communities? So with that, I thank you all for being a part of this morning. And we'll go ahead and end this session. Thank you so much.